My sister stood in the middle of a courtroom, mascara running, voice cracking, and she pointed at me. Not at the man who left her. Not at the mother who looked the other way. Not at the friends who disappeared when things got hard. She pointed at me, her older sister, and she told a judge in front of lawyers and strangers and people who had never met any of us that I owed her, that I was responsible, that if I had done more, if I had tried harder, if I had been there in the right way at the right moment, her life would have turned out differently. She said I owed her because I didn't stop her teen pregnancy. I was 19 years old. She was 17. And I was living in a studio apartment with 2 roommates, working double shifts at a diner, paying my own tuition, and trying, desperately trying, to figure out how to survive a family that had never once made survival easy. But I owed her. Let me tell you what I found out in that courtroom. Let me tell you what happened after years of guilt, years of silence, years of wondering if she was right. Let me tell you what quiet justice actually looks like, because it doesn't always look like a victory. Sometimes it looks like a Wednesday afternoon when the truth finally walks through the door and sits down at the table. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you will never look at the word obligation the same way again. Stay with me, because this story, it goes places I never expected. Before I go any further, if you've ever been told that someone else's pain was your fault, if you've ever been made to feel responsible for a life that wasn't yours to carry, please subscribe. Your support means everything, and it reminds me I'm not alone in this. Hit that button, and let's walk through this together. My name is Maya Tancredi. I'm 25 years old. I live in Boston now, a city I chose deliberately, strategically, and with the full understanding that distance is sometimes the most loving thing you can give yourself and the people who hurt you. But I didn't grow up here. I grew up in a house where the walls were thin and the tension was thick. A house where my father, Walter Tancredi, worked long hours at a logistics company and came home quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that made you hold your breath. My mother, Morgana, was beautiful in that fragile, flickering way that some people are, like a candle in a draft, warm when the air was still, gone when anything moved too fast. And then there was Milani. My little sister Milani was the kind of girl who could fill a room with nothing but her presence. 2 years younger than me, with wild dark hair and eyes that were always looking for something. Adventure, approval, I was never entirely sure which. She was magnetic and reckless, and so achingly vulnerable under all that boldness that sometimes just watching her made my chest hurt. We were close, in the way that siblings are close when the world outside the family is confusing, and the world inside it is even more so. You hold on to each other because there's no one else to hold on to. But closeness isn't the same as health, and love isn't the same as rescue. I learned that the hard way. When I was 16 and Milani was 14, she met a boy named Davis Collins. He was 19, which I want you to sit with that for a moment. 19 years old, pursuing a 14-year-old girl, and not one adult in our house said a word about it. Walter was at work. Morgana thought he was charming. I was 16 and I told Milani he was too old, and she laughed at me and told me I was jealous. I wasn't jealous, I was scared, but I didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. I didn't know how to say, something about this man and the way he looks at you makes the back of my neck prickle. I didn't know how to say, the fact that he prefers 14-year-olds to 19-year-olds is a fact about him, not a compliment to you. So I said he was too old, and she laughed. And Morgana made him coffee when he came over. By the time Milani was 15, Davis was gone. He'd moved on to someone else, a girl named Taylor who was in Milani's friend group, which was its own particular cruelty. Milani was devastated, the kind of devastated that 15-year-olds are, total, consuming, end-of-the-world grief. I held her. I made her hot chocolate. I stayed up until 2 in the morning listening to her cry. I told her she deserved better. She said, "You don't understand love, Maya." And I thought, maybe she's right, maybe I don't. I was 16 and I'd never been in love, and I thought maybe love was supposed to hurt like that, white-hot and destructive, and leaving you emptied out on the kitchen floor. I know better now. But I didn't then. At 17, Milani met Jimmy Sachs. Jimmy was 21, he had a car and an apartment, and he thought Milani was, quote, mature for her age. A phrase that should be a flare shot into the sky. A phrase that means, I know exactly how young you are and I am choosing this deliberately. I was 19 by then. I had just started community college. I was working 25 hours a week at a diner called Holly's, run by a woman named Holly Miller, who was one of the few genuinely decent people in my life at that point. Holly was 53 and no nonsense, and she had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were capable of more than you currently were. I told Holly about Milani once, about Jimmy and the apartment and the feeling in my stomach every time I thought about it, and Holly put her hand on the counter and looked at me and said, Maya, you are not your sister's mother. You are not your sister's keeper. You are her sister. There's a difference. I nodded. I went home and I tried to talk to Milani again. Milani told me to mind my business. When I was 19 and Milani was 17, she called me from Jimmy's apartment crying so hard I could barely understand her. She was pregnant. Jimmy had already told her it wasn't his problem. I drove to that apartment in the middle of the night in a car that I was still making payments on, and I sat on the floor of Jimmy Sachs's bathroom with my 17-year-old sister, and I held her while she shook. I stayed with her for 3 days. I called out of 2 shifts at Holly's. Holly docked my pay, she had to. The diner ran on tight margins, but she also left a container of soup on my doorstep the next day with a note that said, some things matter more than shifts. I talked to Milani about every option, every single one. Not my options, her options. I was 19. I didn't have a home to offer her, not really. I had a twin bed and 2 roommates named Ramsey and Kate who were barely keeping their own lives together. I talked to Walter. He told me it wasn't his place to get involved. I talked to Morgana. She cried and said she'd pray. I called Jimmy Sachs and told him he needed to step up. He hung up on me. Milani kept the baby. That was her choice, and I respected it completely. I helped her as much as I could, which was not as much as she needed, because I was 19 and poor and exhausted. But I was there. I showed up. I drove her to appointments when I could. I bought diapers when I had the spare money, which wasn't often. Her son was born in April. She named him Paul. Paul Sachs. Though Jimmy never signed the birth certificate, Paul was effectively Paul Collins, carrying his mother's name. He was the most beautiful baby I had ever seen. And I thought, maybe this is where things get better. Maybe now, with this baby, with this reason, things realign. I was wrong. Things didn't get better for Milani. They got harder. And in the geography of grief, she started looking for somewhere to put the blame. I moved to Boston when I was 21. I'd transferred to a 4-year university, received a partial scholarship, and cobbled together the rest with loans, work study, and 2 part-time jobs. It was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, not because I doubted it, but because I knew exactly what it would mean. I would be leaving Milani. I would be leaving a toddler named Paul who already knew how to reach his little arms up toward me when I walked in the door. I would be leaving a version of myself that had spent her entire young adulthood trying to fix things she had never broken. I called Milani before I left. I told her I loved her. I told her I would visit. I told her that my moving wasn't abandonment, it was survival. She said, "You're leaving because you don't care." I said, "I'm leaving because if I stay, I'll disappear." She hung up. For 2 years, our relationship was phone calls that ended in arguments and texts that sat unanswered for weeks. Milani's life had become complicated in ways I watched from a distance and felt helpless about. Jimmy Sachs was in and out. there were other men, there was instability, there was Paul growing up in the middle of all of it. She called me when things were bad. She didn't call when things were okay. And when she called and I couldn't immediately solve the problem, couldn't wire her money I didn't have, couldn't fly home on a moment's notice from a life I was building with borrowed time and sheer willpower, she called me selfish. I started to believe her. That's the thing about guilt. It doesn't announce itself as unreasonable. It just settles in, quiet and heavy, and you start to carry it because carrying it feels like the only way to prove you care. I carried it for years. My 23rd year was the one that changed everything. I had just started working at a nonprofit in Boston, a communications role, nothing glamorous, but something I loved. My supervisor was a woman named Gavin's mentor, a woman named Ferguson, Dr. Collins Ferguson, who had worked in family advocacy for 20 years, and who had a habit of saying things that rearranged the furniture in your brain. One day I was eating lunch alone at my desk and she stopped in the doorway of my office and said, without preamble, "You look like someone who's been told their love wasn't enough." I looked up. I said, "What?" She said, "I've seen that face a lot. People who grew up in families where their love was used as leverage, where being related meant being responsible. It's a very particular kind of tired." I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "My sister is about to lose custody of her son, and she's been telling people it's my fault." Dr. Ferguson sat down across from me and said, "Tell me everything." What I hadn't known, what I'd been kept from knowing by the carefully managed information Melanie shared with me and the version of events she told others, was that the situation with Paul had deteriorated significantly. Paul was 4 now. And Melanie was in the middle of a custody dispute, not with Jimmy Sachs, who had long since evaporated entirely, but with Jimmy's brother, Henry Sachs, who had been caring for Paul on and off for the past year, while Melanie dealt with what I would later learn was a substance problem she'd been hiding from me. Henry Sachs was not a bad man. He was a 30-year-old with a stable job and a spare bedroom, and a genuine attachment to his nephew. He'd filed for emergency guardianship after Paul had been left alone for several hours at age 3. What I also didn't know was that Melanie had told anyone who would listen, her friends, her family, her lawyer, and apparently the court-appointed mediator, that the reason her life had fallen apart was because her older sister Maya had abandoned her, had left her alone with a baby, had refused to help, had moved away and cut off contact. She had told them I owed her. I want to stop here for just a second, because if you're watching this and you recognize something in this story, if you've ever had your love weaponized by someone you would have walked through fire for, I see you, I really do. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Your support means everything, and it reminds me I'm not alone in this. Every single person who stays and watches and subscribes tells me that stories like this one matter, that the truth matters, so please, stay with me. Because we're just getting to the part that changed my life. I found out about the custody hearing from an unlikely source. His name was Donald Miller, no relation to Holly, just a coincidence, and he was Paul's preschool teacher. He had gotten my number from an emergency contact form that Melanie had, apparently filled out with my information without telling me. He called me on a Tuesday in November and said, very gently, that he thought I should know what was happening and that Paul was asking about his Aunt Maya and that the hearing was in 3 weeks. I booked a flight. I didn't call Melanie first. I called Henry Sachs's lawyer, a woman named Morgana's polar opposite, a razor-sharp attorney named Kate Davis, who spoke in precise, measured sentences, and who told me, in the span of a 10-minute phone call, more truth about my own family than I had assembled in 23 years of living inside it. Kate Davis told me that Melanie's testimony had included me by name, that I had been characterized as negligent, absent, and financially withholding, that the narrative Melanie had constructed for the court was one in which I was the architect of her circumstances. I asked Kate Davis if she needed me to testify. She said, "I think you should be in that courtroom. Whatever you decide beyond that is up to you." I flew back home 3 weeks later. I took a red-eye. I sat in a middle seat between a man who snored and a teenager with headphones, and I stared at the seat back in front of me, and I thought about every choice I had ever made, every dollar I had sent, every phone call I'd answered at midnight, every time I had driven somewhere I couldn't really afford to drive, every time I had tried. I thought about Paul at 3 years old, learning to say my name. I thought about Holly Miller's soup on my doorstep. I thought about Dr. Collins Ferguson saying, "You look like someone who's been told their love wasn't enough." By the time the plane landed, I had stopped crying. Not because I wasn't sad, I was. But because I had arrived, somewhere in the altitude between Boston and home, at something that felt less like resolution and more like clarity. I knew what I needed to do. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. These things usually are. The spaces where life-altering things get decided are always somehow smaller and more ordinary than the weight of their contents would suggest. Milani was already seated at the plaintiff's table when I walked in. She was wearing a blue blazer I'd never seen before, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked from behind like the girl I'd grown up with, small and determined and armed with something. She turned when I walked in. For a second, just 1 second, her face did something complicated. Something that wasn't quite guilt, and wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite fear. Something with all three ingredients in proportions I couldn't measure. Then she looked away. I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow of the legal proceedings because honestly, court is slow and procedural and a lot less cinematic than television would have you believe. What I will tell you is this. Milani's lawyer, a man named Gavin Paul, young and well-dressed and a little too confident, did bring up my name. He asked the mediator to note that Milani had been without family support, that her older sister had relocated without warning and had severed ties, that the instability of Milani's home life could be attributed in part to the absence of her closest sibling. Kate Davis stood up. Kate Davis was 61 years old, and she had the energy of a woman who had spent 4 decades in courtrooms and had stopped being impressed by bravado sometime around 1998. She said, in a voice so even it almost sounded gentle, "I'd like to enter into evidence a series of financial transfers made by Maya Tancredi to Milani Tancredi over a period of 4 years. I'd also like to note for the record that Ms. Maya Tancredi flew here at her own expense to be present today, and that the narrative of abandonment doesn't survive contact with the receipts." I hadn't told Kate Davis about the money. I hadn't told anyone about the money actually, because it had never occurred to me that it would matter. It wasn't a lot of money. I wasn't wealthy, I am still not wealthy, but it was consistent. Small transfers, $10 here, $40 there, sometimes $100 when I'd had a good month. Groceries, a car repair, Paul's birthday gift, a copay for a doctor's appointment. 4 years of small, quiet deposits that I had made because she was my sister and he was my nephew, and that was what you did. I hadn't saved the receipts. But my bank had. Kate Davis had subpoenaed 4 years of records. And Gavin Paul's confidence, the kind that had probably served him well in cases where the other side wasn't prepared, did something visible in that moment. It faltered. Milani didn't look at me when Kate Davis laid out the transfers. She looked at the table. And I watched her, my little sister, the girl I'd grown up with, the girl I'd held on the floor of Jimmy Sacks's bathroom, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. I felt sad for her. Not in the way I'd been sad before, the guilty, responsible, hollowing sadness of someone who believes they failed. This was different. This was the sadness of watching someone you love realize, in public, that the story they've been telling themselves isn't holding up. Because here's the thing about making someone else the villain of your life. It is not free, it costs you. Every time you hand your pain to someone else to carry, you give up a piece of your own agency. Every time you say it's their fault, you are also saying, I had no power. And that is a devastating thing to believe about yourself, especially when it isn't true. Milani had power. She had always had power. She had made choices. Some of them understandable choices, some of them born from pain and inexperience, and a family that hadn't prepared any of us adequately for the world, but they had been her choices. I hadn't made them. And the courtroom, in its slow and procedural way, was making that clear. The judge, a woman named Judge Holly Ramsey, who had the kind of face that seems to have been assembled specifically for the purpose of being impossible to read, listened to everything. She asked questions in a quiet, careful voice. She reviewed the documents. She awarded primary custody to Henry Sachs, with visitation rights for Milani contingent on the completion of a substance treatment program and regular check-ins with the family services coordinator. She also said, and this part I wrote down verbatim in the margins of my boarding pass stub because it was the only paper I had, she said, "It is not the role of this court to assign blame for circumstances that are the accumulation of many years of individual choices. What this court is charged with is determining what arrangement best serves the child. I would encourage all adults in this child's life to reflect on the ways in which accountability, honestly reckoned with, is the beginning of something better rather than the end of something." I don't know if she was talking to Milani specifically. I think she was talking to all of us. Milani didn't speak to me after the hearing. She walked out of that courtroom with Gavin Paul at her elbow, and her blue blazer and her pulled-back hair, and she didn't turn around. I stood in the corridor for a long moment. Henry Sachs came and found me. He was a quiet man, not like his brother, not like Jimmy's restless, self-serving energy, just a quiet, steady man who shook my hand and said, "Paul asks about you, a lot." I said, "I'd like to see him if that's all right." He said, "I was hoping you'd say that." I spent the following day with Paul. He was 4.5 and he had Milani's dark hair and Walter's eyes, and this way of talking with his hands that I didn't recognize from anyone in the family, and that I decided must just be entirely his own. He showed me his toy trucks and he told me the names of all of them: Ramsey, Ferguson, Davis, Donald, Collins, names he'd invented entirely from thin air, or possibly absorbed from somewhere I couldn't trace. And I sat on Henry Sachs's living room floor, and I thought, here is something whole. Here is something that made it through. Paul is not broken by what happened around him. Not yet, maybe not ever, if we do this right. If enough people show up consistently enough that he builds a foundation that holds. I decided, sitting there, that I would be one of those people. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but because I loved him. Because love, when it is healthy, is a choice that you keep making, not a debt that you keep paying. I flew back to Boston 2 days later. I called Dr. Collins Ferguson from the airport and told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill I have come to believe is actually quite rare, and when I finished, she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Tired, but a different kind of tired than before." She said, "That's the kind of tired that leads somewhere." 3 months after the hearing, I got a text from Milani. It was short. It said, "I know I was unfair to you. I'm not ready to talk about it yet, but I know." I read it 4 times. I set my phone down. I made myself a cup of tea. I picked my phone back up. I wrote back, "I love you. I'll be here when you're ready." I don't know when she'll be ready. I don't know if the story of me and Milani has a happy ending in the conventional sense, the kind where we sit across from each other at a table and cry and hug and forgive and go forward as something new. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. What I know is that I am not waiting for her forgiveness to feel like I am a good person. What I know is that quiet justice doesn't always look like a victory lap. Sometimes it looks like a text message at 11 p.m. that says, "I know." Sometimes it looks like a 4-year-old showing you his truck collection. Sometimes it looks like a bank statement that turns out to be the truest record of who you actually were all along. I have spent a lot of time thinking, in the months since the hearing, about what I would tell a younger version of myself. The 19-year-old Maya sitting on the floor of a bathroom in the middle of the night, holding her crying sister, wondering what she was supposed to do. I would tell her this. You cannot want someone's healing more than they want it themselves. You can show up, you can offer, you can love loudly and consistently and without condition, but you cannot climb inside someone else's life and arrange it into safety on their behalf. And if you try, if you exhaust yourself trying, you will eventually have nothing left, and the person you were trying to save will have learned from watching you deplete yourself that love is supposed to cost everything. That is not love. That is martyrdom wearing love's clothing. I would also tell her this. Guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing. When someone tells you that you owe them, the question to ask is not do I feel guilty, because guilt can be manufactured, guilt can be installed, guilt can be handed to you by someone who needs somewhere to put their pain. The question to ask is, what did I actually do and what did I actually not do? Look at the record, not the record in your head, the one filtered through their accusations and your worst fears about yourself, the actual record. When I looked at my actual record, I found 4 years of bank transfers I'd forgotten I'd made. I found receipts for diapers and car repairs and birthday gifts and phone calls answered at midnight. I found a woman who had done, consistently and without fanfare, what she could afford to do, and who had been told it wasn't enough by someone who needed it to not be enough. That distinction matters. It changes everything. I've also learned something about the people who arrive in your life at the right moment. Holly Miller and her soup on a doorstep. Dr. Collins Ferguson and her too accurate assessment of my face at lunch. Kate Davis and her 61-year-old composure in a courtroom. Donald Miller calling me because Paul was asking about his Aunt Maya. Henry Sacks's handshake in a courthouse corridor. These are not dramatic gestures, they are not grand rescues. They are small, deliberate moments of one human being choosing to see another human being clearly and respond with accuracy and care. I think that is the truest form of love I have ever encountered, not the consuming, destabilizing, I will set myself on fire for you love that I grew up thinking was the real thing. The steady, clear-eyed, I see you and I will tell you the truth love. That is what I want to offer people. That is what I am practicing. I go back to Boston. I go to work. I talk to Paul on video chat every Sunday. Henry Sacks is good about that, I'll say this for him. And Paul shows me his trucks and tells me their names, which change every week. And last week one of them was named Maya, and I did not handle that with the dignity I would have liked to, which is to say I cried on a video call with a 4-year-old, and he looked at me with great concern and said, "Are you sad, Aunt Maya?" And I said, "No, baby, I'm really, really happy." He accepted this explanation, which I think reflects well on him. As for Milani, she started the treatment program, Henry told me. I don't know how it's going because we're not there yet, in terms of talking, but she started. That matters. That is her choosing for herself something better, and I will not stand in the way of that. I will not crowd it with my opinions or my needs or my unprocessed feelings about courtroom testimony. I will wait, and I will be honest when we talk, and I will love her from whatever distance she needs. That is what I have. That is what I can offer. I think for the first time in my life, it is actually enough. Jimmy Sacks, for what it's worth, was located by Henry's attorney in connection with back child support proceedings. Jimmy, who had told Milani it wasn't his problem, who had hung up on me, who had pursued a 17-year-old girl because she was, quote, mature for her age. Jimmy Sacks was located working at a car dealership in another state, and the state in which he had been located had what are called wage garnishment laws, and those laws were, apparently, applied with some enthusiasm. I did not weep for Jimmy Sacks. Walter, my father, after the hearing I called him. He answered on the third ring. I told him, quietly and without drama, that the family had needed him to show up in ways he hadn't, and that I understood he had his reasons, and that I loved him, and that I needed him to understand what his absence had cost. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know." 2 words, same ones Milani sent me in a text. I know. Maybe that is how it starts, not with grand gestures, not with courtroom reversals or tearful reunions, just with 2 words from a person who finally, after everything, stops pretending. I'll take it. Here is what I want to leave you with. If you are carrying someone else's story about who you are, if someone has handed you their pain and called it your fault, if you have been made the villain of a narrative you didn't write, I want you to look at your actual record. Not the record as it has been described to you. Your actual record. Look at what you did. Look at what you gave. Look at the ways you showed up when you were scared and broke and nobody was watching. Look at the text messages you answered at midnight. Look at the money you sent when you could barely cover your own rent. Look at the 3 days you sat on someone's bathroom floor because they needed you there. And then ask yourself, does guilt in this case reflect reality, or has it been installed? Because you do not owe anyone your depletion. You do not owe anyone the sacrifice of your own future on the altar of their unwillingness to change. You can love someone completely and still refuse to be destroyed by them. That is not abandonment. That is survival. And survival, I have learned, is not the enemy of love. Survival is what makes continued love possible. Paul's trucks all have names now. This week the biggest one, the red one he calls the best one, is named after me. I think that's enough. I think that's more than enough. If this story meant something to you, if you saw yourself in any part of it, if you've ever been told that someone else's pain was yours to carry, please subscribe. Your support means everything, and it reminds me I'm not alone in this. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more moments of quiet justice in this life that don't look like what we were promised justice would look like, and I want to tell every single one of them. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment below, tell me your version of I know. The moment someone in your life finally, quietly acknowledged the truth, I rate every single one. And watch the next video, because the story doesn't end here. It never really ends. It just keeps going, forward, always forward, truck by truck and text by text and cup of tea by cup of tea. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.